Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Simon Gosling. I convened the Year 3 Global Climate Change module here in the School of Geography at University of Nottingham, and I also contribute to a number of other modules in the first year and the second year as well, including the first year module, Earth and Environmental Dynamics, for instance. So what I want to do really is just give you a taste of what a lecture might be like at Nottingham. I'm going to spend about 10 minutes or so just talking about a really contemporary topic that's key at the moment, which is that interface and link between the climate crisis and also the pandemic that we're in. Now, I think the first thing to say is that there are quite a few similarities between the pandemic and the climate crisis, not just in terms of how they're affecting the globe, but also in terms of how society is actually dealing with this and trying to find a solution to it. I mean, some of the most obvious similarities are perhaps that both these crises affect large numbers of people. They are truly global events. And that's where, an understanding of geography becomes really important, because we can start to understand the factors that are at play in terms of some of the social dimensions, but also some of the physical aspects that are affecting the pandemic and the climate as well. Secondly, we have past events that we can look back on and understand and use those as analogues for the current situation and how the situation might change in the future. So we can look back at past pandemics, and our head of school, in fact, Matthew Smallman-Rayner, his expertise are actually in understanding past pandemics and human health and how they've played out. So we can look at those past events and use that to understand how the current event might play out, and we can learn from those experiences. And it's the same with climate change. We've seen large climatic changes in the past. They haven't been due to human factors, because the way the climate is changing now is completely unprecedented in human history. But we can look back at past events and understand how they might have affected the climate at the time and what that might mean for future climate change as well. And in terms of how we're dealing with climate change and the climate crisis, there are a number of similarities there as well. Something that we've seen play out quite a bit is that some countries have taken a rather isolationist approach to dealing with the pandemic. We've also seen some international disagreements. Only the other week, for instance, we saw the issue the EU was having in terms of vaccine provision, for instance, and we saw a number of disagreements taking place around that. And in climate change, it's been very similar. For many years, there was no global agreement on climate change because there was quite serious international disagreement on how we should deal with it and how we should reduce our emissions and what is fair to ask different countries to do in terms of reducing their emissions. And another similarity is in terms of how we're predicting these events. So the first lockdown in particular within the UK was informed by a lot of modelling. So numerical models were used to understand how the pandemic might change and how it might affect the UK and what scenarios we could follow to reduce the effects of the pandemic, which is one of the large reasons we went into a lockdown and saw all the various social distancing mechanisms put in place that we have become very used to as a result. And in the same way, climate models are often used to understand how the future climate might change. Something else that we've seen with the pandemic is that evidence shows that early decisive action can actually lower the impact of the threat. Okay, we've seen that in a number of countries that took early decisive action. The effects there were relatively smaller than they were in other cases where the action was perhaps slower. And that's something that translates to climate change very clearly as well. What a lot of the evidence shows us is that in terms of combating future climate change, the sooner that global emissions start to be reduced and the greater their magnitude of reduction is, the greater the benefits we actually see from doing that. And it sounds obvious, but that kind of evidence base, the evidence that shows us that early decisive action can help make the planet considerably better in the future, is what's needed, because you need an evidence base to inform the large-scale policies that we see that exist around international climate change at the moment. And then perhaps one of the last points to note is that there is an acknowledgement that with COVID-19, that it's something that we may have to get used to living with. That's a statement that we've heard within the UK over the past week. It's been noted that this is a disease that we hope we'll be able to control, but it's something that we'll have to get used to and live with. And there's an acknowledgement that with climate change, it's the same. We can't completely eradicate the risk of climate change. Even if we were to reduce global emissions to zero from today, the world's climate would still carry on warming for a number of decades because of the amount of carbon and other greenhouse gases that we've been putting into the atmosphere over past decades. So there is some acknowledgement that we can't eradicate both those risks. So what if we don't actually act on climate change? What would actually happen? This is a graphic here that I led the development of last year. This was something that I produced for the European Commission to inform the European Green Deal, which is the EU's climate policy to be carbon neutral by 2050. In fact, the EU wants to be the first continent in the world to be carbon neutral by 2050, and I helped provide some of the evidence base to support those decisions. What this shows us here is two different worlds. We have a world on the left where we have no action on climate change, and one on the right where we actually mitigate climate change, so we reduce emissions, and we also adapt to some of the changes that we might see in the changing climate in the future. And it's worth just looking at a few of the headline figures. On the left-hand side, we can see that with no reduction in emissions, we could be looking at a sea level rise of about 85 centimetres. But if we reduce our emissions, that could be significantly lower. Okay, it won't completely be eradicated, but it could be around 50 centimetres as opposed to 85 centimetres. And perhaps the most stark difference between these two scenarios on the left and the right is in terms of the economic damages that we would see. It's estimated that the economic damages from climate change due to sea level rise would be around about 240 billion euros every year. Okay, that's the cost to the EU 27 and the UK. But if emissions are reduced, that value drops significantly. It goes from 239 billion per year to around about 12 billion euro per year. Okay, so the benefits of mitigation and adaptation could be really significant, particularly with something like sea level rise. And another example is water scarcity, perhaps. This is some work that a colleague and I published a few years ago. What we did here was we looked at what climate change might mean for future water scarcity. And we looked at the situation in the 2050s, so only 3 decades on from now. And what we actually estimated was that without significant reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, the number of people exposed to water scarcity across the globe could actually increase. And we'd be looking at around about 4 billion people seeing an increase in water scarcity by the middle of the century. And those people are living within the orange and the red areas that you can see on the maps here. And what you'll note is that in some of these regions around the world, they already suffer quite significantly from issues of water scarcity in the current climate. So the risks to future populations in these areas is particularly serious. So of course, this raises the question of, is current action enough? Are we doing enough to avoid some of the effects that I'm just talking about there in terms of sea level rise and water scarcity, for instance? Well, a nice way to think about it is to look at a temperature scale like this, look at a thermometer, and look at a number of targets associated with it. Perhaps the most important target that we'll know of is the Paris Agreement, which was signed back in 2015 at a major UN climate conference. The main goal of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees relative to pre-industrial levels. So we don't want temperatures across the globe to be 1.5 degrees warmer than what they were at pre-industrial times. The reason that number is picked is because a lot of the evidence tells us that if we go beyond that 1.5 degree limit, we start seeing really dangerous effects of climate change. We'll see serious effects on people's health, on flooding from rivers and also coastal flooding, and also effects on agriculture, which in turn will affect things like food security and international trade markets, for instance. Now, concerningly, we're already at 1.1 degrees, so that's where we are at the moment. So are we doing enough to avoid the 1.5, to keep below 1.5 degrees? Is the world doing enough? Well, like I said, we do have the Paris Agreement, and within the Paris Agreement, countries set individual goals on how they want to reduce their emissions going forwards. For example, in the UK, our UK's goal is to be carbon neutral by 2050. We essentially want to reduce our country's greenhouse gas emissions by 100% of what they were in 1990, and we want to do that by 2050. And the EU has a very similar target that I mentioned earlier through the EU Green Deal. Now, if you look at all those policies that exist around the world, they actually suggest we're heading for a world that is about 2.9 degrees warmer than pre-industrial, and it could be as high as 3.9 degrees warmer. But the main point to note is that we're essentially missing that target set in the Paris Agreement. And what that means is we have something known as an emissions gap. Okay, we're essentially committed almost to emitting too much CO2 and other greenhouse gases. It means we miss our 1.5 degree target. Now, what a lot of research shows us is that if we actually want to achieve that 1.5 degree goal, if we don't want to be in this blue area here, if we want to be down at 1.5 degrees, we basically need net global emissions to approach zero by 2050. Okay, similar to the UK and the EU targets that I've been talking about previously. And what this has done is it's led some people to ask whether the lockdowns that we've had over the past year or so will actually help us reach that goal. So we can just look at the first lockdown that we had last year and see what effects that tells us the lockdown had on the climate. As we know, it was a completely unprecedented year, 2020. If we look at road transport, which is what this graph here on the left is showing, you can see for a number of different regions and countries around the world, like Europe, India and China and the US, and also the global level, you can see road transport declined significantly from the point of the pandemic taking hold. You can see for India, for instance, road transport was over 25% of what it was before the pandemic started. And we've seen the same with electricity demand. Electricity demand has significantly declined in many countries across the world in that first lockdown as a result of reduced activity. And this in turn has affected the CO2 emissions. So it's estimated that CO2 emissions were around about 8% lower in 2020. Okay, so they fell by 8%. And that's actually the largest ever recorded drop that we've seen. It was actually 6 times larger than what we saw during the 2008 and 2009 financial crisis, for instance. And it's approximately equivalent to the year-on-year annual emissions that you would need if you want to achieve the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement. So that does lead people to ask the question of, well, is that sustainable? Could we achieve that 8% drop per year going forwards and therefore achieve the Paris Agreement? Well, it's probably not the best way to go about it at all, in fact. Basically, those annual emissions that we saw reduced in 2020, that level of reduction would actually need to occur year on year, whilst at the same time fully restarting the economy, and that would need to continue for several decades into the future. And this graph puts into context that reduction that we saw last year compared to total CO2 emissions that we've seen since 1900. You can see emissions have steadily increased year on year from 1900 as we move towards the right. You can see key events like the Great Depression, the Second World War, and the second oil shock, for instance, and then the financial crisis of 2008 and 2009. And just here, that dip that you see here is the effect of the lockdown in 2020. So essentially, we've already emitted all of this CO2 in the atmosphere. So if we want to mitigate the effects of that and mitigate any effects of future climate change, this trajectory would essentially need to carry on. But of course, it's not sustainable because we need to think about the wider effects that the lockdown has had on society, both in terms of the financial effects it's had, but also in terms of people's health and well-being as well, for instance. It's certainly not a sustainable way to go ahead, which is why the concept of building back greener in a post-pandemic world becomes particularly important, because we can look at ways at which we can try and maintain the reduction in emissions that we've seen, but actually doing it in a sustainable way that allows the economy to continue to function. So to conclude, I think the main points I would say really is that 2020 was an absolutely unprecedented year, and it's highlighted a number of similarities and differences in some ways between how the world has dealt with the pandemic and also how it's dealing with climate change. We know that we're doing a lot to deal with climate change, and we have the Paris Agreement, and of course the US are now re-entering the Paris Agreement, which I think is excellent news for the global climate. But there's still the issue that a lot of the targets that countries have set within the Paris Agreement still aren't actually a bit ambitious enough to achieve the 1.5 degree goal. So going forwards over the coming years and decades, it's going to become really important that countries work together to essentially agree to reduce their emissions by a larger extent, and to do that in an equitable and fair way. So they're the main points I wanted to cover, really. I hope it's given you a flavour of some of the issues and topics that we would cover in geography at Nottingham.